Story 1. When the government decided to turn our town into a reservoir, they told us it was to help generate energy. They didn't tell us what they were trying to drown. When I walked into our house, I was expecting Mom to be there with a frozen bag of peas. She knew the drill. It wasn't my first fight at Round Valley Middle School, but I knew it would be my last. By Monday, every locker, classroom, and lost pair of sweatpants would be under 200 feet of water. But Mom wasn't there. The house was quiet. "Mom," I said. It was 1 p.m., 3 hours earlier than I normally got home. Dad was usually in his office on a work call with Mom in the kitchen working on her next strange project for the last few weeks. It had been pickling carrots. When I walked toward the kitchen, I saw a note on the counter. "Billy went into town to finalize some things. Be home around 5. Peas. Don't let anyone inside the house, even if you know them. Love, Mom and Dad." I crumbled up the paper and threw it in the trash. Then I went to the freezer for my peas. The boy who punched me was an old friend of mine, although we hadn't been friends for a few weeks. Ever since the town decided to forgo our land and turn it into a reservoir, the energy at school shifted. In a way, it felt like our lives were ending, even though the mayor said we were simply moving up the hill. Apparently, reservoirs were good for generating power and would help fund the town's longevity, blah, blah, blah. When I told Dad about that, he simply nodded, then changed the subject. "Whatever they tell you," he said, then started taping up another box. I didn't really understand it. All I did understand was that everything I ever knew would soon be gone. I opened the freezer and pulled out the peas. As I pressed them onto my face, the pain intensified. He got a really good shot on me this time. The fight happened during math class. The teacher scribbled some numbers on the board, then called on me to say what they equaled. I made up a number. 54, I said. The class laughed. My face felt hot. "No," she said. "Sometimes something will take the place of something else, like a symbol taking the place of a number. In this case, the answer is X." More laughter. "Don't worry, Billy," my old friend said, turning to face me. "The monster isn't going to feed on stupid people." When I opened my eyes again, I was on the ground, collapsed between the overturned chairs. He was underneath me, his face covered in blood. People started screaming. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt better. Then he managed to get a fist free and hit me in the eye. I fell back. The teacher pulled me off him. Then, an hour later, I was suspended. They didn't even bother calling my mom this time. The principal told me to walk home. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the cold offering relief as my thoughts did the opposite. I hated being the problem child. I wished I could be more like my sister, even though I kind of hated her. Then, as if she heard me, the door opened. I turned to look. "Shouldn't you be at school?" she asked. My sister was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. Bailey, I could just make her out, my good eye decoding the shapes. "What happened to your eye?" she asked. "What happened to boarding school?" I asked, mimicking her tone. "I took the bus in," she said. "I wanted to spend one more night at the house before they drown us." I sat down at the kitchen table and took the peas off. My whole face was getting numb. Bailey sat down across from me. It was strange that she had come back. Her school was 2 hours away by bus. She wasn't supposed to be home until the holidays. "So," she said, pointing at my face. "Your eye." "It was nothing," I said. "Is someone bullying you?" "No," I whined. "Just stop." She raised her hands in surrender. "Okay, fine," she said. "I'm not trying to make you upset." She looked different today. It had been the longest time we'd ever been apart. I didn't realize how much a face could change in just a few weeks. Mom and Dad are going to be so mad that you're skipping boarding school, I said. I got permission, she said. My teachers thought the reservoir was a mean thing to do to our town. I shrugged, hating that I agreed with her. It wasn't fair that we had to move just because some energy company wanted to build the reservoir. Plus, this whole situation led to a bunch of silly rumors. According to the boys at my lunch table, there was some creature living in the woods, and the water was a way to wash it out. In the last few weeks, a few dogs turned up dead, along with an old woman in her home. According to some eyewitness accounts, drunks, different townspeople had been wandering down Main Street on the night of each attack. Apparently, their mouths were covered in blood. Then, the next day, those same people would be walking around town like nothing happened. Johnny from school said it might be a skinwalker, I said to Mom a few nights after they announced the reservoir. The three of us were around the dinner table, Bailey already off to boarding school. That's silly, Mom said. I think you should switch lunch tables. Dad went on to say that monsters weren't real. The dogs got attacked by a bear. The old woman fell down her stairs. The rumors were just rumors. I was thinking about those rumors as Bailey leaned forward. She brought her voice to a whisper. Do you believe them? She asked. Do I believe what? Those rumors, she said. I shook my head. The punch must have knocked a few screws loose. Was I saying that out loud? I asked. Bailey shrugged. I wouldn't call it a monster, she said, then smiled. Maybe it's just hungry. I looked at her for a moment. She was always correcting me, like everything I said was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. It wasn't enough that she was the pretty one, too. She had bleach blonde hair, blue eyes, and freckles, while I got left with black hair and dirt eyes. Our whole lives, people would stop us on the street and say how cute she was, how she should model or date their sons. I figured I would at least get the brains, but she got that too. She excelled so much at school that the boarding school across the state reached out to us to see if Mom and Dad would send her there, free of charge. I asked if I could go too, and my parents said they could never afford that. So I was stuck at the school down the road with the peeling paint and cockroaches. Tell me about this new school, she said. Where is it going to be? Just up the hill, I said. It's all the same, those same teachers, students, bullshit. Bailey smiled, then stood up. She went to the kitchen and grabbed an apple. She pulled a small knife out of the knife block and sliced off a piece. Change can be good, she said, sliding the cut apple into her mouth. She smiled as she chewed, bits of apple flying out and onto the table. She was normally such a prim and proper eater. It was strange to see her so ravenous. Within a few seconds, she took the knife and sliced off another piece, then slid it into her nasty, apple-filled mouth. I don't want things to change, I said. Before I knew what was happening, the apple was gone. No core, no stems. It had disappeared. Did you eat by the way, she said, her mouth empty again. When do our parents get home? I paused for a moment, inspecting her. I had never done any drugs, but maybe she had started to do them. I knew it made people a little weird. And she was definitely being a little weird, if not a lot weird. Soon, I said. They'll be home soon. Bailey nodded, then glided the knife across her fingertips, pressing down on the skin just enough so it didn't break. It looked like she got some kind of pleasure from the pain. Are you okay? I asked. Bailey nodded, but wouldn't look at me. She looked preoccupied by something. There's barely any trees up the hill, she said. I kept staring at her. She pushed the blade too hard and sliced her thumb. No blood came out. Bailey, I said, you cut yourself. It's not good up the hill. She whispered. shaking her head. The valley was perfect. My muscles tightened. I kept looking at her, scanning for cracks. This was Bailey. It looked like her, smiled like her, talked like her. But something was off. A cold wind coming up from the cellar. I knew I wasn't smart, or good-looking, or charming. But if there was anything I did have, it was intuition. I knew which crop seasons would be good or bad. I always knew when it was going to rain a few hours before. I knew if Mom or Dad were upset by something. When I felt something, it took over all of my senses. And I definitely felt something here. I stood up from the chair and took a step back. Now Bailey's eyes locked onto me. She held the knife in her hand and stepped toward me. "You look frightened," she said. I couldn't talk. My spit dried up. "Don't be frightened," she said. "Tight muscles aren't good for meat." I covered my face as Bailey leapt toward me. Before it all went dark, I could see her features melt away like wax dripping down a candle. Her blonde hair turned to straw grass. Her eyes twisted to something small and beady, like mouse eyes. Her skin wrinkled, then glowed soft and red. She made a sound like an eagle on fire. It filled my head instantly, ravaging my thoughts. As her hands gripped my shoulders, I flew back into the wall, slamming my head on a picture frame. Her breath was hot and rancid, like summer pond scum. Then I heard another sound. The screen door flew open. She jumped off me, and I listened as her claws tapped across on hardwood. I opened my eyes. Bailey, or whatever she was gone. Mom and Dad were standing in the doorway. They ran over to me and lifted me up. Dad looked around, the color stripped from his face. Mom looked like she was going to vomit. "Was it here?" Dad asked. I still couldn't speak. "We don't need to finish packing," Mom said. "Let's just go. We can buy new things, but Bailey," I finally said. "We'll call her at the hotel," Dad said, then lifted me on my feet and pushed me out the door. A moment later, we were in the car. I kept looking out the window, waiting to see her again. Then, in the distance, I noticed something. In the cornfield next to our house, a few rows of crop were flattened, the stalks around them shaking. The hotel was full of people from the town, like some kind of refugee camp. I even saw my old friend who I punched when we locked eyes. We nodded to one another, like the whole encounter had created some kind of respect between us. When the shaking in my hands finally went down, I took a shower and got ready for bed. As I laid there on the stiff motel mattress, I listened as Mom tried and failed to call Bailey's school. By the third attempt, my heart sank. Mom looked worried too. Then, miraculously, I heard her voice. "Sorry," I heard through the phone. I was at the library. "Big exam coming up." Mom continued on with the conversation, her worry melting away. Meanwhile, Dad came over and sat on the bed next to me. He put his hand on my knee and looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, then shook my head. "Sure," I said. "Maybe." "I don't know. Maybe is good," he said. As Mom went on asking her standard check-in questions, I could hear Dad's breathing pick up. He was normally a rock now. He looked like a scared child. I looked up at him. "What was that thing?" I whispered. Dad looked at me, then shook his head. "Just get some rest," he said. "The waters will be here soon." Story 2. I'm blind and operate an elevator for a living. My passengers keep disappearing. Last year, when my 10-year prison stint was finally up and I re-entered society, I encountered some obstacles. Obstacles like lack of upward mobility, prejudices and stigmas, wages and earnings lower than the general population, undesirable and oftentimes dangerous jobs, and lack of protection from wrongful termination. Not to mention an already tough job market and the fact that my parole required that I maintain steady employment or face re-incarceration. Which is why, when I finally got a job offer, after 6 months of aggressive job hunting, I jumped at the opportunity, giving absolutely no fucks as to how I was actually making ends meet. Ever operate a freight elevator before? Mr. Winfred, the manager of the Cornelius, and my new boss, asked me my first day on the job. No, sir, I replied honestly, as I ran my fingers along the doors of the antiquated contraption, the only remaining evidence of the recently renovated luxury building's ancient past. Normally, these old things aren't used for passengers, but the building's pretentious designers thought it might add a certain charm to its otherwise sterile decor. Which is where you come in, he continued, as I heard him slide open the freight elevator's outside doors. Slam, followed by its scissored metal inside doors. Screech. I heard Mr. Winfred step inside and, using my cane, scan the interior of the rather large elevator, which must have been 8 feet by 8 feet, and followed him in. Instantly, my nose was hit with an overpowering, musty scent, like the kind you'd smell in a basement, combined with your grandmother's attic. He then closed both doors behind us. Slam. Screech. Now this here, Mr. Winfred added, taking my hand and placing it on the handle of a lever, is how you move the elevator from floor to floor. Up for up, down for down. You'll hear a click when you reach each floor, which will be helpful for someone like yourself, he said, clearly calling attention to the fact that I'm blind. Someone like myself? I scoffed internally. You ignorant, entitled piece of shit. Truth is, I've always had a bit of a short fuse, which I guess, looking back on it, is what got me into prison in the first place. But in my 10 years of incarceration, I was given tools to combat my anger issues. Tools like reminding myself that it was nothing new. Holes like him were always dropping unintentional microaggressions. It had been something I'd grown used to, and given my probation, wasn't a battle worth fighting. Yes, sir, I replied through my teeth, as I begrudgingly swallowed my pride. Now, why don't you spend today practicing? Our first residents don't move in until tomorrow. In just a matter of a week or so, as the doors of the Cornelius opened to its new tenants, I learned pretty much everything I needed to know about the job. Said tenants were rich, very rich, and most of them acted as such. Entitled, obnoxious, holier than thou, especially given my own social class. But a few of them weren't so bad, and tipped well. Mr. Winfred's assistant, Jane, was a lovely human being. Patient, kind, thoughtful, understanding. Especially when compared to both the building's uptight residents and Mr. Winfred himself. It had been years since I had dated, and the very thought of meeting a partner stressed me out to no end. But if I was to find someone, I hoped she'd be like Jane. The elevator didn't open on the basement level. As I'd learned countless times, it was possible to go there, but the doors simply wouldn't open. The old freight itself was finicky as fuck. Stop the lever 1 second too early, or 1 second too late, and when the doors open, you're halfway between a floor. But eventually, I got used to it, to the point where most of the building's tenants assumed the role of freight operator had always been my job. And when you're good at your service job, and do it with a smile on your face, the tips start flowing. And so, all was well for the first couple weeks on the job. A seemingly refreshing return to normalcy after 10 long years. Until the disappearances started happening. I was just arriving to work one day when I heard about the first disappearance. Have you been in contact with Elizabeth Davis? From room 401, Mr. Winfred asked, after correcting himself. Something he did often, which continued to annoy me. I replied, unsure of where he was going with the question. Not since yesterday. She got back from work, and I brought her up to the 4th floor. But come to think of it, I don't think she rode the elevator down this morning. Like she usually does. Interesting, my boss replied, before continuing. She disappeared yesterday. Disappeared? I asked. Yeah, husband said she never came home last night. Well, I know for certain that I brought her to the 4th floor. Did you check the hallway surveillance footage? Not yet. Unfortunately, the building inspector's in today, and I won't have time until tomorrow. Let's hope she just went somewhere or got lost. In the meantime, keep an eye out. Let me know if you hear of anything suspicious. Yes, sir, I replied, once again resisting the urge to snap on him before heading for the elevator, where I started the day's shift. Slam. Screech. That day, I did my best to do as Mr. Winfred had asked, and listened carefully for any signs of mischief. But the day went on, business as usual, and by the end of the day, I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. Except, the only thing of note was a difference in Mr. Lawrence's demeanor. The tenant of room 805, he was a salesman and acted like one. When I say the man could talk, to a point where whenever he was a passenger in the old freight elevator, despite the long ride from floor 1 to floor 8, I'd rarely have a chance to get a word in. But this time was different. This time, Mr. Lawrence entered the elevator chatting away, just as he always did. But about halfway up, he just stopped talking. And the thing about my job is, if someone chooses to talk or not talk, it's their decision and none of my business. So I left him alone, and when we reached the 8th floor, I simply said goodnight, to which he didn't reply. Must be going through something. I thought to myself, having been unable to truly get a sense of his composure without being able to see him, before closing the double doors and heading off to help the next passenger. Slam. Screech. Later that night, Mr. Winfred called me into his office and asked me to take a seat beside his assistant, Jane. Mr. Owens, are you aware of the situation that's going on in the building? He asked in an interrogating tone. Yes, you told me about it yesterday. The disappearance, sir, I replied. Disappearances now. Plural, he said sternly. But who else? I asked. Mr. Lawrence, what happened to him? Well, to be honest, I was hoping you could tell me. 'Cause much like Miss Davis, the last place he was seen was going into your elevator. What about the cameras in the hallways? I'm afraid that after reviewing the tapes, after stepping into your elevator, neither Miss Davis or Mr. Lawrence ever stepped out, but that's not possible, Mr. Owens. I'm going to give you an opportunity. Is there anything you want to tell me? I know you have a sordid past, Mr. Winfred. Jane interjected, clearly offended by his words and implications. Quiet, Jane, he scolded before continuing. Answer the question, Mr. Owens. I didn't know what to say. I was so shocked, so flustered by what he was implying, that I simply froze. Mr. Owens, he screamed. I don't know. I cried out as I heard Jane squirm in her seat. I'm telling you, the last time I heard from either of them, I took them up to their floors. But I'm your what? Blind? Well, yes, sir. I don't see what goes on inside the elevator. I just let them on and off, Mr. Owens. If they got on your elevator, and never got off. Where could they possibly have gone? I don't know, I replied, at this point, wanting to grab him by force, demand that he never speak to me that way again, and scream out my innocence. But my next parole appointment was the following week, so once again, all I could do was just bite my tongue. Mr. Winfred paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and regained his composure. Mr. Owens, I could go to the police now. And that would be very bad for someone like you. Fuck. He's right. I thought to myself, realizing that if he went to the police, and I was even remotely suspected of what was going on in the building, it was back to prison for me. But lucky for you, he continued, there are things going on in the building that I wouldn't want to bring unwanted attention to. And for that reason, I have decided not to go to the police. Yet, but consider this a warning. And know that I have a repairman coming first thing tomorrow morning to install a security camera inside the freight elevator, so I can see what exactly it is that you're doing in there. I had no idea how to react to Mr. Winfred's continued accusations. So I simply remained silent. Now get out of here and go home. We'll reconvene on this tomorrow, he said dismissively, before Jane walked me out of the room, down the hall, and outside the building, where I planned to return home for the night. 15 minutes later, we were at a bar down the street, where Jane apparently frequented. But where could they possibly have gone? I asked her, my hands trembling at both the thought of people disappearing in the elevator, and that it was happening under my watch. Thing is, Jane said, as she finished her beer, there's something you should know about the building, the Cornelius. No, from before it was called that. It used to be a factory of some kind. Is that what Mr. Winfred was talking about when he said that there were things going on in the building that he didn't want to bring unwanted attention to? Well, yes and no. Yes, in a sense, that Mr. Winfred cut some corners, and rather than fully renovate the entire warehouse, he simply walled off entire sections of the old structure. Like the basement, and no, in a sense, that even Mr. Winfred doesn't know what's really going on in the elevator. Sure, it'd be easy to pin it on you, especially with your criminal record, no offense. But even he knows that it's probably something else. See, that's where things get hazy. Because no one knows what exactly went on at the factory before it became the Cornelius, but rumors have it it was laboratory of some kind, and some fucked up shit went on inside there. Like what? That, my friend, I don't know. But what I do know is, I better be getting to bed. Fair enough. Well, thanks for the drink and the support, I said with a smile as we made our way out of the bar. Yeah, don't let Mr. Winfred get to you. And try not to worry too much. Contrary to Jane's suggestion, that night I worried a lot about the disappearances, what might be causing them, whatever may have gone on in the factory, and most importantly, about everything getting pinned on me. I couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning in bed as my mind raced. And each time I finally passed out, I'd wake up in a panic attack, my heart pounding, short of breath, and in a cold sweat. But it didn't stop there. The uncomfortable feeling of terror and fear, accompanied by the vibrating sensation of adrenaline pumping through my body, remained well into the next morning, when I stepped back into the elevator, terrified by what might be going on inside there. Please don't leave me alone in this fucking thing, I thought to myself. And within a matter of minutes, my prayers were answered. How goes it? The surveillance installation worker called out, his cheery disposition contrary to mine. Not too bad, I replied, lying through my teeth as he stepped inside. But after a minute or two of sharing the elevator with him, my fears lessened and my body relaxed, comforted by the positive conversation and the metallic, clinking sounds of the installation. Everything's okay. The doors are open. And he's talking. I thought to myself. But eventually, the man finished installing the camera and began wrapping up the job. Well, that's it. Cameras all installed and running now, he called out. Let's just take the elevator for a spin and make sure we don't lose the signal. Yes, of course, I replied before reaching for the double doors. Slam, screech, and moving the lever up. We started moving. Fascinating job, I must say, elevator operator. But I suppose you could say the same for mine. Pays the bills, I replied, feigning a chuckle. If he's here and he's talking, then I'm safe. I continued to reassure myself. But a few minutes into our ascent, just like Mr. Lawrence, the man suddenly stopped talking. All right, looks like it's working fine. We can head back down in silence. Hello? I asked, but he didn't respond. Fuck. I thought to myself, realizing that whatever caused Miss Davis and Mr. Lawrence, and seemingly now the repairman to disappear, could still be in the elevator with me. Standing there, shaking, sweat rolling down my brow, I backed myself into the corner of the elevator. As I reached for the lever, pressed it down, and the elevator began to make its descent back to the ground floor. When I finally reached the lobby, ding, I scrambled to open the doors. Slam, screech, and darted out, gasping for air, expecting to find a safe haven. But instead, all I heard was the sound of Mr. Winfred's voice. Where is the repairman? A few minutes later, I was once again sitting in Mr. Winfred's office, next to Jane, this time attempting to explain what had happened. And then he stopped talking. Just like Mr. Lawrence, you know what, Mr. Owens. I'm tired of your excuses. And now that we have a working camera in the elevator, it's time to find out what's really going on inside there, he threatened, as I heard him clicking away on his computer, clearly reviewing the footage. Please do. I cried out. I'm telling you, it's not me. That's when Mr. Winfred and Jane both went silent. Hello, I called out, unable to see what was really going on. Given the fact that my passengers had recently been going silent, the thought crossed my mind that they too had disappeared, but I could still hear their breathing in the room. Breathing that sounded like it was increasing rapidly, until they broke the silence. Oh, my, Jane said, struggling to catch her breath. That can't be. Let me rewind the tape, Mr. Winfred mumbled, the most scared I had ever heard him. What is it? I asked, as they seemingly played back the video. I would later find out from Jane that the footage would show myself and the repairman in the elevator, as a slithering, grotesque humanoid figure suddenly climbed down from the roof of the elevator, wrapped its slimy arms around the repairman, then somehow hopped back out of the elevator and pulled the man up with it, leaving me standing there, completely unaware of what had just happened. But in that moment, Mr. Winfred must have realized the complications associated with reporting such a bizarre phenomenon, and instead decided to finally pin it on me. Mr. Owens, you shouldn't have done that, he cried out. Mr. Winfred, what are you talking about? Jane asked. You and I just watched the same footage. That's when I heard him drag a file to his computer's trash and delete it. Crunch. Stay out of this, Jane. This man has killed 3 people in the elevator. I knew I shouldn't have hired an ex-con. But, sir, I didn't, I tried to reply, before he interrupted. Mr. Owens, I'm picking up the phone and calling the police. I'd suggest you just stay put, but Mr. Winfred, I'm telling you, I didn't do anything. Yes, is this 911? I'm the manager of the Cornelius, and I'd like to report 3 murders in my building. "We'd better go," I heard Jane say as I felt her place her hand on my shoulder. "And yes, I have reason to believe the killer is our elevator operator, an ex-convict who is sitting right in front of me. Come on, let's go." Jane screamed as she tugged at my shirt. I hopped up from my seat, and she led me out of the office, down the hall, and into, of all places, the old freight elevator, as she explained to me what she had seen on the surveillance tape. Slam. Screech. "Take us to the basement," Jane called out. "But the basement is walled off," I replied. "Just do it," she insisted. Before I moved the lever down and the elevator began to move. I spent the ride catching my breath until we finally reached the basement level. Ding. "Now what?" I asked, but Jane didn't reply. Jane, oh fuck. I thought to myself. The monster. That's when I turned to the center of the freight elevator, where Jane had been standing, reached out into the unknown, and sure enough, felt the cold, slimy skin of the creature wrapped around Jane's face, preventing her from making a sound. Not knowing what else to do, I gripped its disgusting appendages with both hands and slowly pried it off Jane as she let out a scream. And the monster's arm quickly slithered away, back up through the roof of the freight. Jane dropped to the ground, coughing violently. "You okay?" I asked her, but rather than responding, she simply handed me something. I opened my fist to find a pair of keys. The lock above the lever. "Unlock it," she instructed, still coughing, as I felt around the lever, found the lock, inserted the key, and unlocked it. Click. The doors. "They should open now," Jane said as she stood up, having finally caught her breath. Screech. Slam. We arrived in the dark basement to smell the same musty odor from the freight elevator. After her eyes adjusted and she scanned our surroundings, Jane informed me that this floor looked nothing like the other 8 newly renovated floors, with their modern feel and minimalistic designs. Instead, the basement was a window into the building's former self, when it had been a factory. Its walls brick and crumbling, its floors concrete and cracked, and scattered everywhere were the dusty remnants of laboratory equipment. Devices, machines, tanks, most of which were destroyed, or disconnected, or both. "What went on down here?" I asked. "From the looks of it, something inhumane," Jane said, after she picked up a few tattered pieces of paper from one of the lab stations, and told me what was on it. "The first page looks like some sort of a diagram of a man being pumped with chemicals from tanks, and the second, a drawing of the creature from the elevator. In pencil beside it, someone appears to have labeled it the silencer. Silencer." I thought to myself, before remembering that the creature seemed to always silence the sounds of its victims, and to have been repulsed by Jane's scream. At the same time, it had never bothered me in the elevator, as I tended to stand there in silence. But before I could dwell too much on the thought, Jane interrupted. "If you don't mind my asking, what did you go to prison for in the first place?" she asked. "It's okay," I said, surprised she had waited this long to ask, before contemplating the best way to explain what had happened. "Cause of my temper. Some guy was being a dick on the train platform. We got into a scuffle, and he accidentally fell into the tracks. Over what?" "Did he insult you?" "Your blindness?" "No, I'm afraid not," I replied. "We were drunk and arguing over a basketball game, of all things." "He was." "My friend, oh my God." "I'm so sorry. It's okay." Jane put her hand on my shoulder, and we stood there in silence for a moment, until suddenly we heard the sound of Mr. Winfred and the police approaching, as they ran down what must have been a hidden set of stairs from the ground level to the basement. "Come on, follow me," Jane called out as she took me by the hand and led me into what I'd soon discover was a labyrinthian network of old passages, while the police and Mr. Winfred both called out to us. "This is the police. Put your hands on your head and turn yourself in. You're trapped, Mr. Owens. Just confess your crimes, and you'll simply go back to jail." We continued to run deeper and deeper into the passages as our pursuers began to close in on us, their footsteps getting closer, and closer, and closer, until suddenly the sound of their footsteps was replaced by that of screaming, and they suddenly went silent. "What the?" Jane whispered. "The creature," I whispered. "It must be down here." That's when we hatched a plan. Having found our way out of the labyrinth and back to the entrance of the laboratory, where we had arrived in the old freight elevator, I found myself standing alone, waiting, as I nervously tapped my cane on the basement floor, Jane having gone off on her own. That's when I heard Mr. Winfred emerge from the passages, alone, and call out to me. "Mr. Owens, there's nowhere to run. Even your beloved elevator is gone. You're cornered," he taunted, as I backed toward the elevator and tapped at it with my cane. Its doors open, its shaft empty. "What did you say?" I asked, encouraging him to talk louder. "What are you, deaf now too?" The ignorant old man snapped back. I said, "You have nowhere to run." "I'm sorry. You'll have to forgive me," I said sarcastically, pointing to my ears. "Can you repeat that again?" That's when Mr. Winfred began approaching and screamed, "You worthless ex-con. I knew I shouldn't have hired you in the first place. And now you'll go back to where you belong." But suddenly, Mr. Winfred went silent. As the creature must have wrapped its slimy tentacles around his face. That's when I seized the opportunity, ran over to Mr. Winfred, gripped the cold body of the creature, which was indeed wrapped around him, turned, and flung them both behind me into the hollow elevator shaft. Slam! Before hitting the up button on the wall and calling the freight elevator down. Suddenly, the gears of the elevator above could be heard turning away, and the machine began its quick descent down. "Mr. Owens, no?" Mr. Winfred cried out, clearly now separated from the creature. I froze for a moment as my mind raced back to the night of the tragic accident, when my friend called out to me from the train tracks, and I was unable to save him in time, until I eventually snapped myself out of it and willed myself to save Mr. Winfred, no matter how evil the asshole's intentions may have been, reaching out my hand out and pulling him up and out of the elevator. Just as the freight car came crash down to the basement level. Slam. Crunch. Rah-ah-ar, the slimy beast cried out as it was crushed under the old elevator's weight. Ding. The basement fell silent for a moment, until screech. Slam. Jane stepped out and said, "Going up?" But the joke was met with silence. I simply stood there, shaking, as Mr. Winfred did the same, clearly shocked by the events that had just occurred. A few weeks later, after the authorities had done a full sweep of the basement and cleared out all traces of the building's old laboratory, I found myself once again back in the manager's office. "Mr. Owens, this is the last time I'm going to tell you this," Jane joked as I heard her recline back in what was once Mr. Winfred's chair, having been named interim manager since her boss's recent and ironic prison sentencing. "Who's the convict now?" I said with a smile before making my way out of the office. "Wait," Jane said, stopping me at the door. "You sure you want to go back to operating the elevator? After all that's happened?" Like I said, The doorman job is yours if you want it. What's the worst that could happen? I replied with a smile. There's another one of those creatures in the building somewhere? Story 3. Nothing's been the same since the crash. I 38 meters and the janitor for an elementary school just down the road. I love my job. I take pride in making the school look great for the start of every class day, and all the kids smile and wave and call me Mr. Janitor, despite my name tag as they walk by in their neat little lines. At least, everything was great until the crash. One morning, 7 o'clock sharp as always, I was turning out of my driveway to hurry to the school. But just as I did, a car came speeding over the hill to my left and struck my car. Once I woke up in the hospital, something didn't feel right. It was oddly quiet. A nurse came in shortly after, but she seemed distant. All of her movements seemed slow, as if we were both underwater. She unhooked me from all the machines, which I noticed hadn't been making any noise, and handed me back my clothes. The hospital provided me a bus home, which was nice, since I knew my car would be totaled, and I knew I'd never afford a new one. Once I was home, things felt a bit more cozy. I still felt a little cold and dizzy, but assumed it was whatever painkillers they'd had me on. The next morning, I figured I'd just walk to work. It was only 10 meters or so up the road, so I'd just have to plan for it. I woke up the next morning, half an hour earlier than usual. In a bit of a daze, I changed into my uniform and set off toward the school. It was strangely quiet, and I finally noticed why. No birds were chirping. The sky was a steely gray, as it had been the day before. Once I was at work, I was scarcely noticed. The kids would occasionally glance up at me, but almost never waved or smiled. For most of the adults, it was as if I wasn't there. Strangely, this felt right. I kept up my mopping until lunchtime and retired to my closet. I glanced at my reflection in the shiny chrome of the boiler and noticed I was unusually pale. I shrugged it off and ate my cold tuna sandwich. The next day was more of the same, but I noticed the cold grayness of the weather seemed to make its way indoors. Walking through the brightly colored hallways, all I saw were dull tones. It was as if the color had been sucked out. On the way to my closet for lunch, I took a painting off the wall of the second-grade hallway, which had used to be a bright watercolor of a rose. I hung it up in my closet, irrationally hoping to save away some of the world's color. In doing so, I thought to put 2 fingers to my wrist and checked my pulse. Nothing. I tried again. No beat. I tried my throat. Nothing noticeable. My skin was cool to the touch and paler than the day before. I considered calling my doctor, but the world outside felt distant, almost imaginary. I went back to mopping, noticing that the students stared into the ground as they walked by or strayed through me as if I didn't exist. The worst part was that I started noticing shadowy figures when I turned quickly. I would see a blip of cloudy darkness when I slowly turned around, and if I rounded a corner too sharply, I'd sometimes see an indistinguishable dark mass somewhere in the distance. Some nights later, I started having nightmares, which was uncharacteristic of my normal, calm sleep. Sometimes in the dreams I was at work, and one of the little children would look up at me, and its eyes would be dark sockets. Sometimes I would be standing far above the school, looking down into fog and slowly plummet. Sometimes a car would come up the hill just as I checked my mail and veer off the road toward me. As the days went on, the clouds stayed gray and the outside got foggy. Sounds continued to get more muffled, and my thoughts and movements continued slowing. It was as if I was a character in a play and submerged in a lake all at once. My skin was clammy and gray, and nobody noticed my existence. The dark figures kept getting sharper, sometimes appearing just behind me in my dreams, which had become third person. I could start to make out a hooded individual, cloaked in shadow, staring at me. I almost took comfort in it, the only being that could still recognize my existence. I felt cold all the time, but no blankets or warm clothes helped. As the days ran on and the world slowly faded, the only thing that grew clearer was the figure. He was braver now, standing just out of sight, around corners and objects. I knew I should be scared of him, but I could hardly feel anything, let alone fear. Finally, one quiet day, as I walked the halls with my mop, it showed itself. I stared into its hollow eyes, willing it to do whatever it was fated to. It held out its hand as if for me to shake it. Suddenly, for the first time in weeks, I flashed back to my old life. I saw color again, saw smiles, and outside, saw green foliage and a blue sky. I wasn't ready. I shook my head. As if in recognition, the figure bowed its head. I felt the world go black around me. I woke up, once again, in a hospital bed. This time, when the nurse walked in, she was animated and talkative. I was surrounded by little noises, the beeping of my pulse, the chirping of birds, footsteps in the hallway. Once I was released, I saw green and red and orange autumn leaves, and the next morning, I showed up to work again to cheers and waves and welcomes back. I don't know where I was for those few weeks. I thought it was a dream at first, but in my janitor's closet, just behind the vacuum cleaner, hung a faded, darkened watercolor, a watercolor of a rose against a gray sky, splotchy and wilting. Story 4. I'm the owner of a small diner in the middle of nowhere, and I like to give travelers who come in a discount provided they tell me a story about their lives. Over the last decade, I've heard some really terrifying things. Hey there, strangers. My name is Allie Mae. I'm the owner of a small diner tucked away in a town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. The diner doesn't really get much action aside from townsfolk and the occasional out-of-towner passing through and looking for a hot meal. And when those folk happen to come by, I like to introduce myself, bring them their food, and then sit down with them and explain a little game I like to play to pass the time out here. For some context, I inherited this diner from my parents and have spent practically my whole life in this town aside from the rare trips to nearby events markets, state fairs, etc., but those are really only reserved for special occasions. And I don't mind that. I enjoy the peace and quiet that comes with my lifestyle, and I can't deny that as far as lives go, I happen to have myself a pretty good one. I have wonderful friends, the sweetest husband, and a beautiful baby girl named Kate. But as nice as my life is to me, I can't deny that it's also real slow. Not many big things have happened to me, if y'all understand what I'm saying. And so, whenever an unknown face walks into my diner, I ask them if they have any stories to tell me. And if they do, I'm always more than happy to give them a discount on their meal. I've been doing this since I was 22, so about 10 years now. Okay, I'm going to admit something a bit embarrassing to y'all. The reason I had when I first started to do this was that I had recently found out about the notion of cryptids, and I thought the concept was pretty damn cool. More specifically, I thought people viewing me as a cryptid would be pretty damn cool. You know, some girl in some diner in the middle of nowhere that you end up spilling your darkest secrets to and then never see again. Wouldn't that be a kind of neat way to be perceived? Well, my spooky little young adult self thought so, and that's where it all began. Normally, people are quite hesitant to talk at first. However, they tend to warm up to the idea After I remind them not only will we likely never cross paths again, but I don't care about what kind of story they tell me. Whatever they feel like talking about, I'll listen to. I just want a break from the monotony of small-town life. And boy, have I heard it all. Love affairs, childhood traumas, batchet deathbed confessions heard by nurses. The story of a very intoxicating and very hush-hush-to-month relationship a customer had with another woman in college before she tragically passed in an accident that she's never told a soul about since. Especially not her very Catholic now husband, but besides all that jazz, there's one type of story I keep being told. Horror. Now I get why this is. Ghost stories, supernatural shit, whatever you want to call it, that's the kind of thing people are hesitant to talk about. And in my opinion, half of it is because that's the kind of thing people are hesitant to believe. But who cares if you tell it to me? You're not going to see me again, so what's the harm in finally telling someone? It even wouldn't matter if I didn't believe them. They'd still get the discount. But I do believe the stories people tell me. It's something in their eyes, I think. When I look into them, I can see they're being haunted by something awful. And I think it helps them to talk about it. To leave here with the knowledge they're not carrying that burden alone. And carrying it with them is something I'm thankful I get to do. I listen to their stories, bring them sweet tea and dessert to cheer them up afterwards. I'll hold their hands if they'll let me, just generally try to help them. It's one small way I can make an impact on some people who are really hurting, being the kind stranger they can confide in knowing that they'll be believed. But anyways, I've told my husband some of these stories over the years, and he recently started browsing this subreddit and mentioned to me that I should think about sharing some of them with y'all. And so here I am, sitting in my comfy chair after my baby girl finally fell asleep with my laptop and my absolutely darling cat Cinnamon. I really do hope you guys enjoy the story I decided to share today, and I'll probably post some more soon. It was about 5 years ago now. I think this happened sometime in early July, so it was just after my 27th birthday. A young woman stumbled into the diner. I'd guess she was maybe a few years younger than I was. 23 maybe? Well, the poor thing looked like she hadn't properly slept in weeks, with eye bags so dark I had to take a moment to figure out if they were actually black eyes. She sat down at a booth, and I came over to pour her some coffee, which she gratefully accepted. I took her order waffles with powdered sugar and a side of mixed fruit, and moved to sit down across from her. Instead of asking if she had stories to tell, I decided to ask her if she was all right. As the way her eyes shifted around the room and the way her hands trembled so violently as she tried to use the cutlery made me nervous that she was in some sort of danger. She looked at me and her eyes began to water, and in the softest voice you could ever imagine she just told me that I wouldn't believe her. It was here where I explained some of the parts of my game, focusing on the fact that there's really no harm from talking about it if she wanted to. Our paths would probably never cross again. I remember the way she looked down at the table as her hands moved to scratch quite violently at the skin on her arms, which were just covered in long red marks already. My heart absolutely ached at the sight, but I decided not to say anything for the time being, though it took everything in me not to reach over and take her hands away and hold them myself. Finally, she sighed and met my gaze as she nodded ever so slightly at me. She told me she had a stalker, and not one she thought was human. The first time she saw him was a few months prior, when she was walking to her dorm alone one night back, when she lived right by the Appalachian Mountains. She had gone out with some friends and didn't realize how late it had gotten, and by the time she had started to make her way home, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The fastest way to get home meant she had to use a small path that cut through the woods. And she told me she was too worried about the big test she had to get home to study for to really think about the dangers of walking through there at night. As she walked, she said she got that awful feeling that she was being watched, and out of nowhere, she was hit with this horrific wave of anxiety, that her heart began to race like a scampering jackrabbit, and she broke into a cold sweat. And then she noticed it watching her through the tree line. It was tall and vaguely man-shaped, although she said she would hesitate to call it that. And by tall, she meant inhumanly tall, roughly 7 or so feet by her guess. Its skin was a sickly pale, and its eyes were bloodshot, accompanied by an impossibly wide grin that revealed way too many horribly stained teeth. From what she could see, the thing was completely hairless and was dressed in camouflage-type clothing, the kind that hunters in the military wear. She said that she froze up when she saw it, staring at the thing in absolute horror. And it just stayed there, smiling at her. Eventually, she snapped out of it and bolted, yet the thing made no move to follow her. All it did was turn to face her and continued to smile as she ran off. She told me that when she got back to her dorm, just got this sudden urge that she was going to be sick. And this was super weird, since the girl had only thrown up twice in her life. Once when she got a really bad case of the flu when she was 10, and once when she got a little too drunk at a party in high school. Yet she had spent the next 10 minutes throwing up everything in her stomach and the next 20 dry, heaving over the toilet. Her roommate had rushed in to find her covered in sweat and violently sobbing as she puked her guts out for no apparent reason. She had tried to tell her about the thing that she saw in the woods, but her roommate had told her that she was probably just sick with something, and her mind was playing tricks on her. She said that night she had supposedly had these beyond horrible nightmares, and her roommate told her the next morning she had woken up screaming 4 separate times. That was her first encounter with the thing, but it certainly wasn't the last. At this point, she had begun hyperventilating. Tears ran down her cheeks, and a strangled cry wrenched itself from her throat. I quickly ran over to the counter to get her some napkins and a glass of water before I finally gave in and grasped her shaking hands and held them tightly. I had asked her if she wanted to stop, but she just shook her head, and so I held her hands and waited for her to continue with her story. She said she realized pretty quickly that whatever it was came with the night. At first, she genuinely had just believed she had come down with some kind of awful virus, but when she woke up the next morning shaken and exhausted, but by all other means healthy, she was very confused, but didn't really know what else to do than email her professor to explain her situation and sit on her couch and watch episodes of her favorite show while she apparently clung onto her roommate for dear life. That was until nightfall came around and she saw the thing again, and this time it was watching her from her living room window. Instead of freezing up again, she just started to scream, and when her roommate rushed over to see what was wrong, she looked out the window and went pale as a ghost. She asked her roommate if she was seeing it too, and she just nodded before dragging her out of sight from the thing's view and calling the cops. Her symptoms immediately came back. The vomiting, the panic attack-like behavior, the sweating, all of it just like the night before. For some reason, though, her roommate was completely unaffected. Shaken, sure, but no sickness, no nightmares, nothing. Just like the few other people after that who saw it when they were with her, although nobody ever saw it without her. And then the police showed up and things got even worse. They couldn't brush her concerns off, even in the state she was in. Her perfectly healthy roommate had seen it too. And so they began to look into things. And what they found was absolutely nothing. The thing couldn't be seen on the security camera footage right beside where it had been standing. They couldn't find a record of any person matching its description in their databases. No matter how many times she called over the next 3 months, no matter the situation, no matter if there was another person there who insisted they saw it too, they couldn't find any evidence of it being there or any record of its existence. She went to a psychiatrist who determined she didn't seem to be suffering from any sort of psychotic disorder, and other doctors at the local hospital ran every test they possibly could to explain her symptoms. Head CT scans, MRIs, they all came back totally clean. She had no head trauma, tumors, any type of head injury that could be causing hallucinations. Her blood test showed there was no autoimmune disease that could explain the symptoms. She did gastric emptying scans and other similar tests which eventually confirmed there was no disorder that could explain the vomiting. The symptoms never happened during the day, during testing, or in any other situation. She never got sick, had any other type of nightmare or hallucination. She just kept seeing whatever the hell that thing was and getting violently ill. Eventually, she decided to just try her best to stay inside after dark, which worked for a while until the night where everything went very wrong. She had gone to a local cafe to get some homework done and accidentally fell asleep at her computer and had woken up to one of the waitresses gently shaking her awake and telling her it was closing time. Their closing time was 10 p.m. The sun had set over an hour ago. Her hands started to shake more violently than they already were, which I didn't even think was possible, and she choked back another sob before she continued to speak. She dug through her backpack to find her pocket knife and tucked it into her jacket sleeve before she began to brave her way through the darkness back to her house. The cafe was only a 10-minute walk with the shortcut, 20 if she stayed on the streets. She considered her options for a moment, trying to figure out which was more dangerous. She eventually decided that while the streets would take longer, they were better lit and maybe still had some people out. It wasn't that late, but this wasn't exactly a college town either. There wasn't exactly a nightlife besides a 1 or 2 bars. Odds were that she could make the whole trip and run into less than a dozen people. She had made it 10 minutes before she got the feeling she got on the path again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched coupled with cold sweats and horrible anxiety. She slipped her knife out of her jacket into her hand and held it out in front of her as her gaze shifted to the nearby alleyway. And there it was, tall and pale as death, with the same bloodshot eyes and smile with too many teeth, and that same damn camouflage outfit it always seemed to wear. Only this time, it also held something else. A bouquet of wilted flowers. As the thing held them out to her, she turned and bolted down the street, all thought of defending herself from that thing long forgotten. This time, though, it dropped the flowers and took off after her. And this was the first time she realized just how fast it actually was. She told me she had always been a good runner. She did track in high school and even made the state finals. And this was without a doubt the fastest she had ever run in her life, but this thing somehow caught up to her in a matter of seconds. And then it reached out and grabbed her shoulder. At this, she took her hands away from mine and pulled down one of the sleeves of her yellow woolen cardigan, revealing her bare shoulder, and my breath caught in my throat. On her shoulder was a large scar resembling the shape of a hand. Palm on the shoulder itself, the outline of long fingers marking the top of her arm. My first thought was about the time I was 17 years old and saw a story about a woman who had acid thrown on her face on TV. It looked almost like that, but if a person with inhumanly long hands somehow managed to cover their own hand in acid without injuring themselves and gripped her shoulder as hard as they possibly could. Or maybe like a third-degree burn in the shape of a hand, like if it was from a person who was made of pure fire. She sniffled softly, which pulled me out of my thoughts. In a whispered voice, she told me that the doctors said whatever burned her ate away the fat and a good portion of the muscle in that shoulder. She can barely lift that arm now. As the tears ran down her face, she talked about how the pain she felt in that moment was like nothing else she'd ever felt before. She couldn't even describe it. She remembered collapsing to the ground screaming bloody murder, and right before she blacked out, she said she saw the thing lean over her. And with that horrible smile still on its face, it hissed out one word to her. Soon. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Even after the wound healed, the pain never stopped and never got better. And that was it. That was the final straw for her. She withdrew from college, packed up her things, and moved states to live with her parents again. And for 1 week, things seemed to be okay. She thought maybe it didn't follow her here. Until a bouquet of the same wilted flowers and an empty chocolate box stuffed to the brim with bloody human teeth and fingernails appeared on her parents' doorstep. It got closer after that, more and more cocky, until the night where it actually knocked on her window, banging on the glass with an almost maniacal frenzy until the police arrived. By that point, of course, there was nothing there. Not a trace. Since then, she's just been driving around the country. Her parents have been sending her money for food and motels. She figured that if it took a week to get from her old town to her parents' house and only seemed to come out at night, then maybe she could keep ahead of it if she just kept moving. After a moment of stunned silence, I asked if I could hug her and rushed over to pull the shaking girl into my arms as soon as I got a nod of approval. I spent the next half hour gently stroking her hair as she sobbed into my shirt. I wanted to help this poor girl so badly, but deep down, we both knew there was nothing I could actually do to keep her safe. But I told her the meal was on me, and I took her back to my house. It was still light out after all, so I figured it was safe. I let her take a long shower and helped bandage up her arms, made her dinner, and introduced her to my cat. And then I cut up some fruit and placed it in Tupperware containers along with some cookies, and gave her directions to the nearest motel. I still think about that girl all the time. It's been half a decade, and I haven't heard anything about her since. I don't know if she was killed by that thing or if she managed to outrun it. But I still pray every single night that one of these days she'll walk back into my diner and tell me the story of how she defeated that monster over more waffles covered with way too much powdered sugar and a side of fruit.